Hello and welcome to Console Cowboys. So in this first video, I thought we would talk about all of the different types of consulting there is, because most people are only familiar with that external consultant that works as a W-2 employee and provides penetration testing services for their company to large organizations to, assess their security. And there's a lot more to it than that. We're going to talk mostly on the corporate side, but there's also government consulting. I'll touch on that very shortly before we dive directly into categorization of the different corporate side things. So first off, you got your government consulting. And the differences I noted while doing government consulting for years, because I've been consulting for like 25 years, and I've done all of these different types we're going to talk about today. But on the government side, one thing I noted was, there's different certifications that you need. Right? You might need a CISSP, you might need a CEH, you might need your top secret clearance or your secret clearance or your SCI on top of that, depending which project you work on and which type of job categorization that you have will require different things that, aren't required in the corporate world. People might want things in the corporate world, but they aren't required generally. Right? So there's a lot of requirements with the government stuff. Also, there's a different feel to it, and it's hard to describe this feel, but you'll know whether you like government versus corporate by working in each, because it's a totally different feel. I also noticed in the government stuff, I'd be locked behind ciphered doors sometimes working on projects for months at a time, in information warfare centers, just kind of diving into all kinds of things with reversing, etc. Or sometimes I was actually doing pen testing, but it tended to be longer gigs. Right? It wasn't a week-long gig. I might be like, 3, 4, 5 weeks within some military base somewhere, out at like a space place like NASA, etc., where you're just diving into things at these different government facilities for months at a time and working with their teams there and just kind of, it's much longer, it's much more relaxed, but there's a lot of restrictions as far as what you can do. In my opinion, usually the salaries are a bit lower. And they sometimes have really crazy requirements of years. Like I remember one of those 3-letter agencies tried to hire me one time, and they wanted like 10, 12 years of experience back when there wasn't even penetration testing, like more than 5 years in the industry. And you're like, dude, this didn't exist 15 years ago. Like, this is ridiculous. So there's a lot of just like requirements and restrictions. And that's all I'm going to go into with the government consulting side. Now let's talk about the corporate side. And the way I look at the corporate side is there's about 4 different categories in my mind. There's your classic, consulting that you're thinking of where, you work for a W-2 employed state where it's a large vendor and they're just doing all these jobs for companies. Then you have, your internal jobs that function like consultancies, but you're within an internal team at a large organization and you're performing the same tasks, but it tends to be a bit slower. And then you have your 1099 consulting, which is similar to your external consultant at the company, but it's your own business now. You're a self-employed individual. And then you have your owning your own consultancy, which comes the whole gambit of other issues that we're going to get into in a minute. So let's start out with your standard consultancy. So with your standard consultancy, the main thing to note is that coming in, you are perceived as an expert by the clients, even if you're not. So when you get on a job for your employer, that person that you're doing a job for, that organization and the people you're interacting with, they're gonna ask you a lot of questions and assume you know the answers to them, even if you don't. So working as a consultant, you need to have a high level of wanting to learn all the time. And we're going to get into learning stuff later and how to really build up your skill sets. But just think that you're always going to want to learn your craft. If you're a net pen tester or you're a web pen tester or whatever, just dive in deep and understand the defensive part. You got to understand the offensive part, because you're going to talk with defensive people who have to fix things. You're going to talk with the internal pen test teams who want to learn the cool things that you did during the pen test. You're going to talk with high level people like executives, and you got to be able to tell them, the impact to their business. Like, okay, this hurts your bottom line here. This hurts your reputation here. This is how it impacts the business as a whole. That'll affect you as a CEO when you get popped and you're embarrassed, versus talking to the technical teams where it's like, okay, I exploited this flaw in this way and I bypassed your restrictions here with all these nitty gritty details. You got to understand how to talk to different people. right? And you got to constantly be learning things because you are viewed as that expert. Like they're literally going to view you as an expert coming in. That's what they're hiring you to be, right? So a good story here is I remember I was doing some web assessments. I was doing some physical breach stuff. I was working in information warfare centers, and I got like a straight up pen test role in one of these external shops. This is a long, long time ago. We're talking like mid 2000s. And first thing they told me when I walked in is, you have 6 months to learn to deliver every single type of penetration test we do. So that was wireless assessments, internal assessments, external network assessments, web assessments, teaching secure coding classes, right? I'm not a developer. I can code, but I'm not a developer. But I need to learn all these things and more, VoIP assessments, real niche stuff, VoIP, Zigbee hacking, etc. Right? And I had to learn all of this in 6 months. Whereas these days, you tend to work in one thing. You tend to be a net pen tester or a web pen tester or some guy who does niche stuff, more like IoT or something like that. But the thing was, I walk in there and all of a sudden, bam, I need to become the expert of everything in 6 months. And there is no, oh, I can't do that. Or, and back then, like there wasn't even labs for these things. So it was much harder. These days, it's awesome. You can get yourself up to speed in anything you want in 6 months. It's phenomenal. But that's the thing, right? It's a lot of pressure on you to be the best, and there's a lot of churn and burn. So each week you're going to get a new pen test, which gives you incredible experiences in all types of technologies, because maybe 50 projects in that year or 25 projects in that year, depending if they're a week long or 2 weeks long, you're going to get a lot of experience. Dial in your methodologies, get really, really good, and learn all those pen test processes. Learn about your kickoff calls and your closeout calls and your scoping and all the different things throughout the whole pen test process that then you can take into your own business later on. I suggest a lot of people do, 2-3 years of this external consulting, just build up those skill sets and learn all those processes before trying to like YOLO into their own business that they don't even understand how things work yet. But there's a lot of perceived restrictions with this as well. So if you work for one of these organizations, they're going to try to own everything you do, right? You might make, the next iPhone, code it all up, do all the hardware. That company is going to try to own that item you did because you signed a bunch of papers when you signed up saying they own your firstborn child. So when you actually, and I'm going to get into this later, when you start looking at these contracts and doing negotiations, you need to redline this stuff out. You need to be stern about your what you will accept and what you don't. We're not going to get into that right now, but just something to think about as we go through here. I want you to think about where you are in this consulting world, which is the best fit for you now, where you want to go to, and your ultimate goals, because we have to define a lot of goals throughout this whole thing. So the last thing to think about really with this type of job is it's a W-2 employed job, which means that you are going to pay your taxes out of your paycheck before any of your expenses, which means your take home is going to be a lot lower. As if you follow Robert Kiyosaki and the financial guys, they'll always tell you that the people who pay the most money are those high paid doctors or those high paid positions, because at this point you have no control over your taxes. So you understand this. You might make way more jumping your salary from 150 to 200K, but you might end up paying more taxes. You have no way out because you can't expense these things. Also something to think about as we get into more self-employed stuff. So now let's talk about similar but very, very different, and that would be your internal pen test shop roles. Now, a lot of these will run like consultancies. You'll get a new gig every week or every 2 weeks, or sometimes you have a little bit longer because you're working with internal teams. You might have a month or 2 months to work on a gig. You're going to get a good amount of experience, but you're not a perceived expert anymore. You're working in a security team. You're working with other people that are going to help you out, and maybe you're going to do web app testing, and then you're interested in something else and you need to dive into some stuff with some other people. But you're working with app owners instead of your clients now, right? So you might have all these different app owners of hundreds of different applications, and you'll get on kickoff calls with them, talk about their applications, execute, give them the report, do a readout, just like you would with the external contracting, but now you're building up them slowly, because you might work with them throughout the year. You're building up their security practices, you're helping them mature with their coding, and just build better practices of automating things. It's a lot more comprehensive because you got to understand all your DevOps and your agile programming and what these actual different teams are doing, so you can understand the language of what they're doing and fit in your recommendations to how their teams work so that you can make them better rather than fighting them. Because as an external consultant, you're just like, hey, this is the way you fix things. This is what I found. And you walk away, maybe have a conversation with them, but you're not really helping them mature over time. In a sense, you are, but you aren't. But as the internal role, you can really help those teams get better and better. And you also have your own security team to leverage off to help you along the way, because you're a team of people now. You're not really an individual consultant just ripping in. And yes, as that external consultant, you do have that team behind you, but they're all busy as hell. They're churning and burning tons of pen tests. They're going to help you where they can, but it's a different vibe. It's much slower. You tend to have longer gigs, and it's a different feeling overall. You're building relationships with those departments over time, as I mentioned, and you're helping mature their programs. Now, there's also a little bit less restrictions on your personal time. You might not be signing a bunch of non-compete agreements. They're probably not going to try to own everything you do unless it's exactly the type of stuff they produce, right? So if you're working for a financial organization, you're opening your own, financial related thing, they might be like, hey, what are you doing here, right? But if it's something completely different in the hacking world, they're not going to try to own your hacking project. So you have a lot more freedom to do things on the side. You also have more time. It tends to be really, really slow. You might even have times of the year where there's complete code freezes and you can't even test anything, which means you can do a ton of learning. These places usually have bigger budgets. They'll send you to SANS classes, and you might be able to do a lot of side work during these slow times and make more money than they're paying you as a W-2 employee on the side during fourth quarter, right? You might end up, maybe making $150,000 a year on this internal shop, and you make an extra $100,000 just in a few months on the side because there was all these code freezes. There's nothing else to do. You have no, non-competes. So that's something to think about, right? It's a lot different than those external consulting places. They're not going to allow that. They're going to freak out on you if you do stuff like that. But it's a lot more acceptable in the internal world, just as long as you're not stepping on toes and you understand where you work for and what that environment is and how things function. Now, the next thing we'll get into is more of a self-employed option. It's going to be similar to your external penetration tester for your W-2, but you're now self-employed as a 1099 consultant. Now, you might be doing subcontracts from your previous old job where you were a consultant there, or maybe you're getting your own direct clients. Maybe you're working internal in another organization, but you're just on a 1099 contract. But the difference here is this is your own business. So yes, you're doing your pen tests and you're going through that whole pen test process, but these are your projects now, which means you need to find these projects. You need to project manage these projects for yourself, unless you're subcontracting and they're giving you project managers. That happens a lot, but it's your own business. There's a lot more income potential though. So whereas you're working as a W-2 employee, most of that income coming in is going to the company, and then you're getting whatever your defined salary is with the 1099. It's all going to you. And unlike those internal jobs and the consulting company job as a W-2, where you're getting all of your taxes taken out of your paycheck before you can expense. Now, you're making a ton more money, but you also do your expenses before you give your taxes to the government, which means you can arrange your taxes, arrange your facts to change your tax, meaning that you can create entities that lower your tax burdens. And I'll get into some resources and then what you can look up there later when we talk more about business stuff. But you essentially can start dropping your taxes from more of that 40, 50, 60%, depending where you live, down to more in that 20% range just by changing your facts of how your business runs versus working as an employee, because now you're in control of your taxes before they hit the government, and you can arrange things in a much better way for yourself where you're completely in compliance with your taxes, but you're making things set up better for yourself, which is absolutely awesome if you're looking to do that. The other thing to think about is, much like that external consulting company, is that this is a place where you have to be an expert now, and you might not have anybody else to lean on. You don't have those teams to ask those questions. Sure, you have lots of friends and you're going to look stuff up, but at this point, you should already have your methodologies down. You should already have working the whole pen test process down. You should have done this at your internal jobs as an external consultant. You need to understand everything inside and out. You need to understand how these internal organizations work so you can deal with them at different levels as you're interacting with them through the process. It's a lot different because now you're owning your own business. You're accountable and you're responsible for everything from beginning to end, from business acquisition to performing the actual job. It's quite a bit different. But there's zero restrictions, right? Everything you write, every blog you do, every piece of code you write is yours for your business, building up. Maybe you're building up a brand, maybe you're building up your own name, and you're going to dive into other things later. But this is all owned by you now. There's no such thing as non-competes unless you sign something silly with an organization you're working with, but you need to redline all of that stuff out, and we'll get to that later. Don't, put yourself in a corner if you don't have to. But you need to start learning about entities, and you need to also start learning about investing at this point, right? You need to learn how money works, and you need to learn what to do with that money as you're making it, because if you don't, it's all going to be gone. Or like we're in a recession right now, the money you're making could build generational wealth, but you need to learn how to put that to work now. You're not having your 401ks, which is a terrible option anyway. You're in control of your own finances from every aspect of it. So there's a lot of different things going on there. Now you could do this as a full-time gig, like I'm talking about here, or like I talked about with the internal teams. Maybe it's just part-time 1099 while you're in an internal team where you have no restrictions, and that can work as well. But you need to kick ass and really do an awesome job, because now it's your reputation you're building with every gig you do and every interaction you have. And you'll be blackballed if you do a bad job here, which is why you need that experience before you hop into something like this. But if you're willing to work hard and really go for it, this is a good option. I have guys that come to me as complete juniors. We train them up beginning to end over a couple-year process, and they're absolutely amazing consultants, and they have no bad habits, and they're doing awesome, making twice as much, 3-4 times as much as any W-2 employee. And they came from nothing. Maybe they came from like working at Best Buy, and so it's a great place to be, to have a lot of freedom, and they're out working in random places in the world and loving life. So it's a great place to be. So it's a good option. It might not be for you. W-2 option as an employee might be a better option for you. Depends where your mindset is. Now, the final one we're talking about, and I've done all of these right now, I own my own consultancy, and that's a whole new thing, right? So I was talking about you have to start learning a little bit more about business when you have your 1099. Well, when you're running your own consultancy, you have to dive into new levels of business, right? So you got to understand stuff like finding work for not only you, but the actual people who work for you, and understanding the different personalities of people that work for you. There's a great book, I think it was Built for Growth or something, that starts talking about the different habits and behaviors of different type of people, where some people are community driven and they try to build up these things around communities, where others are like born leaders. They want to be left alone and they do their own thing. And certain people really want those affirmations and hey, you're doing a great job. Otherwise they just feel like garbage. Whereas others like me, I just want to be left alone. Just hack into things. You leave me alone and I'm a happy camper, right? So you got to start understanding your employees, understanding that business side. You got to understand that you now have to solve problems that are not your own, right? There might be some stuff popping off you had absolutely nothing to do with, but you have to own that. It is your responsibility. Another good book, Extreme Ownership. Go read that book. Awesome book. You need to own every single part of that business process. It is your fault if your employee F's up. So you need to fix it. It is your fault if anything goes sideways, because you should be teaching these people, training them, having them get better, and there's no excuse in between. You have to own and be accountable for everything. You need to start learning new business entity stuff. Like maybe you've outgrown your S Corp and it's gotten so big, and you start like using trusts and different planning of different things and integrating different types of entities together to, best maximize your taxes and the way things flow, and you got to start learning about these things. And I'll give you resources for all these things as well later on. But there's a lot more upside potential, right? So it's like cash flow now, right? So you're making money, but your employees are making money, and you're making money from that, and then you're paying them. But like now you have passive cash flow coming in on top of the work that you're doing. So it really maximizes your potential. It's a good place to be, but it's definitely not for everybody. Like you shouldn't even be thinking about this until you've learned all the pen test stuff. You've learned all the business stuff. You've worked as a 1099 consultant. You can manage yourself. You shouldn't even think about managing anybody else and dealing with anything else. Otherwise, it's just going to fail. And you have to start thinking about things too, like there's all these business people that are going to hit you up, and they're going to want to, control your business and do all these traditional things that are just going to destroy your business. You have to learn to focus and just wipe out the noise and focus on what matters, which is getting good work done. So I'm trying to think if I missed anything else here before I shut this one up here. No, I really think that's about it. So hopefully you kind of got a good perspective now of like where you want to be within this industry, like maybe short term or long term, or just it gave you a good overview of things that you didn't think about as far as the consulting world. In the next one, we're going to dive directly more into actual consulting issues and perception and accountability and ways to handle things to like really stand out as a consultant. And that's going to be the next video. I'll drop that in a few days. I've been banned from YouTube as usual, so I'm popping this one out a little late, but I already have the other video like completely taped, so I'll dump that out in a few days. And hopefully you learn something. Like ask any comments you want in below. I'll add those as videos later, and please share this out with everybody. I really appreciate everybody checking it out. Thank you much, and catch you later.